I was a mechanic sabotaged by rivals until I proved they were selling stolen parts. But in that moment when Marcus Chen slammed my termination papers on the oil-stained workbench, his eyes gleaming with manufactured disappointment, I knew this wasn't about the missing catalytic converters or the supposedly botched transmission job on the mayor's Lexus. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as I stared at the pink slip, my hands still black with engine grease, still warm from the job I'd been doing perfectly for 8 years at Chen's Automotive. Marcus stood there with his arms crossed, his pristine polo shirt a stark contrast to my work coveralls, waiting for me to break down or beg or storm out in rage. I did none of those things. Instead, I folded the termination letter with surgical precision, creased it twice, and slipped it into my breast pocket. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, and I watched his confidence flicker for just a moment. A micro-expression that told me everything I needed to know about what was really happening here. Behind Marcus, Tony Ramirez leaned against the parts counter, his thick arms folded, trying to look casual but failing to hide the smirk tugging at his lips. Tony had been my closest friend at the shop for 6 years, the guy who'd taught me the intricacies of European transmissions, who'd vouched for me when I'd applied for the senior mechanic position. Now he wouldn't meet my eyes. The pieces clicked together with the satisfying precision of a perfectly timed engine. Tony's sudden flush of cash over the past few months, the new truck, the expensive tools he'd been flashing around, the way he'd been volunteering for evening shifts, staying late when the shop was supposedly closed for deep cleaning, the mysterious parts orders that never seemed to match our inventory logs, and Marcus, standing there in his pressed khakis like some kind of automotive executive, instead of the guy who used to get his hands dirty alongside the rest of us before his uncle died and left him the business. Marcus, who'd been making noises about upgrading the shop's image, attracting a more upscale clientele, maybe moving to a better location across town where the real money was. I gathered my personal tools, the snap-on socket set my father had given me when I graduated tech school, the torque wrench I'd saved 3 months of paychecks to buy, the small LED work light that had illuminated 1,000 repairs. Each item went into my toolbox with deliberate care, creating a metallic symphony that echoed through the suddenly quiet shop. The other mechanics, Jimmy, Carlos, and Danny, had stopped what they were doing to watch the show, their own faces carefully neutral. They knew the game being played here, understood that keeping their heads down was the smart move. I didn't blame them. They had families to feed, mortgages to pay, their own survival to consider. But I also saw something else in their eyes. Relief that it was me getting thrown under the bus and not them. That stung worse than Marcus's fake disappointment or Tony's betrayal. When I finally looked up from my toolbox, Marcus had composed himself again, putting on the concerned boss act. His mouth moved in what I'm sure were carefully rehearsed words about performance issues and customer complaints, about how this was a business decision, nothing personal. But I wasn't listening to his lies. Instead, I was cataloging details. The slight tremor in his left hand, the way he kept glancing toward the back office where he kept his computer, the defensive positioning of his shoulders. Fear. He was afraid of something. I hefted my toolbox, its familiar weight a comfort in my hands, and walked toward the exit. But I paused at the threshold, turned back, and looked directly at Tony. For just a moment, his mask slipped completely. I saw guilt there, yes, but also something else, desperation. Whatever he'd gotten himself into, it was bigger than just screwing over an old friend. The parking lot was empty, except for my 10-year-old Honda Civic, sitting lonely under the afternoon sun like a faithful dog waiting for its owner. I loaded my tools into the trunk, my movements automatic, my mind already racing ahead to what came next. 8 years of my life. 8 years of showing up early, staying late, taking pride in work that most people never saw or understood. 8 years of building relationships with customers who trusted me with their most valuable possessions outside of their homes. 8 years of earning Marcus's uncle's respect, of being the guy he called when the really complicated jobs came in. All of it erased in 5 minutes of corporate theater. I sat in my car for a long time, watching the shop through my rearview mirror. Customers came and went, unaware that their trusted mechanic had just been fired on trumped-up charges. The afternoon shift change happened right on schedule. Jimmy and Carlos heading out, the evening crew filtering in. But Tony stayed, and Marcus stayed. That was interesting. I started my engine and drove slowly past the front windows, catching a glimpse of them huddled together near the service counter, their heads bent over what looked like paperwork. Even from a distance, I could read the tension in their body language. This wasn't a casual conversation between boss and employee. 3 blocks away, I pulled into the parking lot of a strip mall and sat in my car again. This time making a mental inventory of everything I knew about Chen's Automotive that Marcus probably wished I didn't. The shop's supplier network, the customer database, the inventory management system that Tony had trained me on 2 years ago when we'd upgraded from the old paper system. The security camera setup, including the blind spots that everyone on the crew knew about, but never officially acknowledged. Most importantly, I knew the shop's rhythm, when it was busy, when it was quiet, when the different shifts came and went, when Marcus usually left for his long lunches and longer golf games. I also knew Tony's weaknesses, his gambling problem that he thought nobody had noticed, his tendency to cut corners when he felt pressure, his habit of bragging about his scores when he'd had a few beers after work. And Marcus. Marcus had always been the weak link in his own operation. Too eager to play the successful businessman, too quick to trust the wrong people, too arrogant to believe anyone would be smart enough to see through his schemes. By the time I drove home to my small apartment across town, I had the skeleton of a plan forming in my mind. Nothing rushed, nothing sloppy. If I was going to do this right, I needed time, patience, and most importantly, I needed evidence. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything I could remember about the shop's operations over the past few months. Unusual parts orders, customers whose repairs had taken longer than expected, vehicles that had been in the shop overnight for what should have been simple day jobs. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. High-end imports staying in the shop for extended periods, parts orders that didn't match the work being done, Tony's mysterious evening shifts, supposedly for deep cleaning and maintenance, but which never seemed to result in a noticeably cleaner shop. And the customers, I started recognizing a type. Expensive cars driven by people who paid in cash, who didn't ask many questions about the work being done, who seemed more interested in getting their vehicles back quickly than in understanding what had been repaired. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my photos from the past few months. Like most mechanics, I had a habit of documenting unusual jobs, interesting problems, before and after shots that might come in handy later. I hadn't been thinking about building a case back then. I'd just been doing my job. But now those photos look different. A BMW with high-end aftermarket parts that didn't match its service history. A Mercedes with a suspiciously new catalytic converter that the customer claimed had never been replaced. An Audi with performance modifications that weren't reflected in any of our work orders. Each photo was time-stamped. Each one showed Tony or Marcus in the background, working on these particular vehicles during those mysterious evening shifts. I made copies of everything, stored them in multiple locations, both digital and physical. If this was going to work, I needed to be absolutely certain I had my facts straight. Accusations without proof would just make me look like a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, which, to be fair, I was. But I was also right. The next morning, I started making phone calls. Not to lawyers or police, not yet. Instead, I called customers. People whose cars I'd worked on over the years. People who knew me and trusted my judgment. I told them I was no longer with Chen's Automotive and was considering starting my own mobile repair service. Did they know anyone who might be interested in reliable, honest work? The conversations were revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose Honda Accord I'd kept running for 3 years, mentioned that she'd had some work done at Chen's recently, after I'd been fired, and the price had been surprisingly low. Almost too good to be true, she said. But who was she to complain about saving money? David Park, a lawyer who drove a Lexus GS that I'd service regularly, told me he'd heard rumors about Chen's getting into the used parts business. Nothing official, he said, but word was getting around in certain circles that they could source hard-to-find components for luxury vehicles at very competitive prices. Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus despite the name, mentioned that her insurance company had recommended Chen's Automotive for some bodywork after a minor accident. The repair had been excellent, she said, but she'd been surprised when the adjuster had commented on how quickly they'd been able to source genuine OEM parts that were supposedly back-ordered everywhere else. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. By the end of the week, I had a clear picture of what was happening at Chen's Automotive, and it was bigger than I'd initially suspected. They weren't just selling stolen parts. They were running a sophisticated operation that involved insurance fraud, parts laundering, and quite possibly vehicle theft. Tony's gambling debts had made him a perfect recruit for someone looking to expand their operation, and Marcus's legitimate business provided the perfect cover. But I still needed proof. real evidence that would hold up to scrutiny. That's when I remembered the security camera system. Chen's had installed a full network of surveillance cameras 2 years ago, after a break-in had cost them several $1,000s in stolen tools. The system recorded everything to a central server in Marcus's office, with footage automatically backed up to cloud storage for insurance purposes. The system I had helped install, the system whose passwords I had helped set up, the system that Marcus had never bothered to change after firing me. Probably because he assumed I wouldn't be stupid enough to try anything illegal. He was wrong about the stupid part. On a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after my termination, I parked 2 blocks away from Chen's Automotive and walked through the alley behind the building. The shop closed at 6, and by 7:30, the parking lot was empty, except for the vehicles waiting for service the next day. I knew the building's weaknesses because I'd worked there for 8 years. The back door had a faulty lock that we'd been meaning to fix for months. The motion sensors in the shop area had a blind spot near the parts storage room. And the security cameras, ironically, couldn't see their own recording equipment. Getting inside took less than 2 minutes. The server room was nothing more than a converted broom closet next to Marcus's office, housing the digital video recorder and network equipment. I'd spent enough time in there over the years helping with various technical issues that I could navigate it in the dark, which was exactly what I did. The DVR system was password protected, but not very creatively. Marcus had used the same password for everything in the shop. Chen 1975, the year his uncle had founded the business. I'd seen him type it dozens of times. The system contained 6 months of footage, organized by date and camera location. I started with the evening shifts from the past few months, fast-forwarding through hours of empty shop footage until I found what I was looking for. There it was, Tony and Marcus working together on vehicles that weren't on any of our official work orders. Vehicles that came in after hours through the back entrance, with their license plates either removed or obscured. Vehicles that arrived as stolen wrecks and left looking like legitimate repair jobs. I watched Marcus direct Tony to remove serial numbers from catalytic converters, replace VIN plates, swap out engine blocks between vehicles. I watched them photograph parts and upload the images to what looked like an online marketplace, probably some dark web operation for selling stolen components. Most damning of all, I watched Marcus count stacks of cash while Tony loaded unmarked boxes into the trunk of his new truck. Boxes that I recognized as coming from our parts supplier, but which had never appeared on any official inventory logs. I copied everything to a portable drive, methodically organizing the files by date and content. Video evidence of theft, fraud, parts laundering, and conspiracy. Enough to put both of them away for years and to vindicate my wrongful termination. But I wasn't done yet. While the files were copying, I accessed the shop's computer system, the same system that Marcus had used to generate my fake termination paperwork. His computer was still logged in, another careless habit that I'd observed over the years. His email inbox was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Communications with parts suppliers who were clearly aware they were dealing in stolen goods. Correspondence with insurance adjusters who were being fed false information about repairs and parts costs. Messages coordinating with what appeared to be a network of chop shops and theft rings across 3 states. I copied everything, including deleted items that Marcus probably thought were gone forever. 8 years of working with computers had taught me that people rarely understand how difficult it actually is to make digital information disappear completely. The financial records were even more damning. Bank statements showing cash deposits that didn't match the shop's official revenue. Invoices for parts that had never been delivered to legitimate customers. A whole shadow accounting system that tracked the real money flowing through Marcus's operation. By the time I finished, it was nearly midnight. I had enough evidence to destroy both of them and to expose a criminal network that probably stretched far beyond our little automotive shop. But I still wasn't satisfied. They had cost me more than just a job. They had cost me my reputation, my professional relationships, my sense of security. 8 years of building a career, gone because Marcus needed a scapegoat and Tony needed money for his gambling debts. Simply turning them into the police would be justice, but it wouldn't be revenge. For that, I needed something more creative. I spent the next 2 weeks studying their operation, using the information I'd gathered to understand exactly how their criminal enterprise worked. The stolen vehicles came from a network of professional thieves who operated throughout the region. The parts were laundered through a combination of legitimate repair work and fraudulent insurance claims. The money was cleaned through a series of cash businesses that Marcus had investments in: restaurants, car washes, small retail operations. It was actually quite sophisticated, which made Marcus's carelessness even more frustrating. He'd built an impressive criminal operation, but he'd gotten sloppy about security. Overconfident, arrogant. That arrogance was going to be his downfall. I started with Tony. I knew he was still gambling, still accumulating debts faster than he could pay them off with his legitimate salary. His criminal income had probably just encouraged him to bet bigger, chase larger wins, dig himself deeper into the hole that had gotten him involved with Marcus's operation in the first place. Through some careful social media reconnaissance, I learned that Tony's bookie was a man named Sal Moretti, who ran a small bookmaking operation out of a sports bar across town. Sal had a reputation for being reasonable with his clients, but only up to a point. After that point, he got creative about collecting debts. I made an anonymous phone call to Sal's bar, posing as someone who'd overheard Tony bragging about a big score he was expecting. According to my fictional story, Tony had been shooting his mouth off about how he was about to come into some serious money from a parts deal, enough to pay off all his debts, and maybe even place some bigger bets on the upcoming football season. I gave Sal just enough details to make the story believable. Tony's full name, his place of employment, the amount of money he typically owed at any given time. I made it sound like Tony was planning to skip town with his windfall rather than pay his debts. The call took less than 5 minutes, but it accomplished exactly what I'd intended. Within 48 hours, Tony would be under pressure from multiple directions. Sal would want his money immediately, not at some vague future date. And if Tony tried to explain that the money was tied up in an ongoing criminal operation, well, that would just make Sal more interested in getting his cut. While Tony was dealing with his suddenly impatient bookie, I moved against Marcus. I created a series of anonymous emails to the insurance companies that Chen's Automotive worked with regularly. The emails contained just enough information to raise suspicions without revealing how I'd obtained it. A suggestion that they might want to audit some recent claims, a hint that certain parts suppliers might not be as legitimate as they appeared, a casual mention that some high-value vehicles had been spending more time in the shop than seemed necessary for the work being done. Insurance companies hate fraud more than almost anything else, because it costs them money directly, and they have entire departments dedicated to investigating suspicious claims, with investigators who are very good at their jobs and very persistent when they catch the scent of organized fraud. I also reached out to a few automotive trade publications, using a throwaway email account to suggest they might want to investigate reports of stolen parts being laundered through legitimate repair shops. I provided just enough detail to make it worth their while to look deeper, but not enough to implicate myself in any criminal activity. The beauty of this approach was that once the investigations began, they would take on a life of their own. Insurance investigators would find things that I hadn't even thought to look for. Trade publications would interview other shops, other mechanics, other people who might have noticed suspicious activity. Law enforcement would eventually get involved, armed with complaints from multiple sources, but I wasn't finished yet. The most satisfying part of my revenge was still to come. I had noticed during my research into Marcus's operation that he was planning something big. His emails referenced a major score coming up, something that would set him up financially for years to come. He was coordinating with his network of thieves to target a specific location, a luxury car dealership across town that specialized in high-end European imports. The plan was sophisticated but not foolproof. They would hit the dealership on a weekend night when security was minimal. They would target specific vehicles that had already been pre-sold to customers in the black market network. The cars would disappear into their parts laundering operation, providing inventory for months of profitable fraud. Marcus had scheduled the heist for the coming Saturday night. He'd even arranged for Tony to have the shop ready for an unusually large number of vehicles to be processed over the following week. I had all the details: the time, the location, the specific vehicles they planned to target, even the names of the professional thieves Marcus had hired for the job. And I had something else: a contact at the FBI's Auto Theft Task Force, courtesy of a customer whose BMW I'd serviced for 3 years before discovering that he was a federal agent. Agent Sarah Mitchell had always been friendly during her visits to the shop, and she'd given me her card once, mentioning that she appreciated working with honest mechanics who understood the difference between legitimate repairs and insurance fraud. At the time, I thought it was just casual conversation. Now it looked like providence. I called Agent Mitchell on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days before Marcus's planned heist. I explained that I was a former employee of Chen's Automotive who had stumbled across evidence of a major theft and fraud operation. I offered to provide evidence of past crimes and information about a significant theft that was planned for the coming weekend. Agent Mitchell was interested, very interested. We met that evening in the parking lot of a suburban shopping center, far from any location where Marcus or Tony might spot us. I brought copies of everything I'd gathered: the surveillance footage, the financial records, the email communications, the documentation of the parts laundering operation. Agent Mitchell reviewed the evidence with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen a lot of criminal operations. She asked pointed questions about how I'd obtained the information, and I answered honestly about everything except the small matter of how I'd accessed the shop's computer systems after being fired. Some details, I decided, weren't relevant to the larger picture. When she finished reviewing the evidence, Agent Mitchell looked at me with something approaching admiration. She told me that they'd been aware of an increase in high-end auto theft in the region, but they hadn't been able to identify the organization behind it. My evidence filled in most of the gaps in their investigation and provided them with enough probable cause to obtain warrants for surveillance, financial records, and arrests. More importantly, the information about Saturday night's planned heist gave them an opportunity to catch the entire operation in the act. Agent Mitchell asked if I would be willing to testify if the case went to trial. I told her I would be happy to do so. What I didn't tell her was how much I was looking forward to seeing Marcus's face when he realized that his carefully planned criminal empire was collapsing around him. Saturday night, I positioned myself in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner with a clear view of Chen's Automotive about half a mile away. I wanted to watch the fireworks. The FBI had coordinated with local law enforcement to set up surveillance at both the dealership and the shop. They'd also obtained warrants to monitor Marcus's and Tony's phone communications, so they would know exactly when the operation was set to begin. At 11:47 p.m., I saw the first police cars moving into position around the shop. Unmarked vehicles mostly, but I'd learned to recognize the signs after watching enough crime shows over the years. At 12:23 a.m., the action started. Marcus and Tony arrived at the shop separately, within minutes of each other. Tony was driving his truck, ready to transport whatever stolen goods the heist produced. Marcus arrived in his personal car, probably planning to supervise the operation from a safe distance. They were inside the shop for less than 10 minutes before the first stolen vehicle arrived, a BMW X5 that had been taken from the dealership's lot approximately 30 minutes earlier. The professional thieves had done their job efficiently, but they'd been followed every step of the way by FBI surveillance teams. The second vehicle, a Mercedes GLS, arrived 15 minutes later, then an Audi Q8, each one followed by discreet law enforcement units that maintained visual contact without revealing their presence. Marcus and Tony moved the vehicles into the shop bays and immediately began the process of altering VIN numbers, removing identifying marks, and preparing the cars for dismantling. They worked with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. They had no idea that every move was being recorded by surveillance teams positioned around the building. At 1:45 a.m., just as they were starting to disassemble the first vehicle, the law enforcement teams moved in. Even from my position half a mile away, I could see the sudden explosion of activity. Police cars, FBI vehicles, even a SWAT team, all converging on Chen's Automotive with the precision of a military operation. The building was surrounded in seconds. Floodlights illuminated the shop from every angle, turning night into harsh, artificial day. I watched through binoculars as Marcus and Tony were led out in handcuffs, their faces showing the stunned disbelief of people whose world had just collapsed without warning. The professional thieves were arrested simultaneously at the dealership, caught in the act of preparing to steal additional vehicles. But the most satisfying moment came when I saw Agent Mitchell approach Marcus, probably to read him his rights and inform him of the charges he was facing. Even from a distance, I could see Marcus's face change as he realized the scope of the case against him. This wasn't just a bust for the current night's activities. This was the culmination of a comprehensive investigation into months of criminal activity. This was evidence of conspiracy, fraud, theft, money laundering, and racketeering. This was the end of everything Marcus had built. I watched as they loaded the arrested men into separate vehicles, as crime scene technicians began processing the shop and the stolen vehicles, as the first news crews began arriving to cover what would undoubtedly be a major story in the local media. Then I drove home, satisfied with a job well done. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The story broke in the local newspaper on Sunday morning. Major auto theft ring busted in weekend operation. The article mentioned that the investigation had been ongoing for several months and had resulted in the arrest of 6 individuals, including the owner of a local automotive repair shop and several professional car thieves. By Monday, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets and automotive trade publications. Chen's Automotive was shut down pending a full investigation of its business practices. Marcus and Tony were being held on multiple felony charges, with bail set at amounts that neither of them could afford. I received a call from Agent Mitchell on Tuesday, thanking me for my cooperation and informing me that my evidence had been crucial to the success of the operation. She also mentioned that the investigation was expanding as they uncovered additional connections to other criminal operations throughout the region. On Wednesday, I got a call from David Park, the lawyer whose Lexus I'd serviced for years. He'd read about the bust in the newspaper and had put two and two together, realizing that my sudden departure from Chen's Automotive had probably not been coincidental. He asked if I'd be interested in pursuing a wrongful termination lawsuit against Marcus. I told him I'd think about it. By Friday, I had received calls from 3 different automotive shops in the area, all of them offering me positions. Word had gotten around in the local mechanics community that I'd been the whistleblower who'd exposed the Chen's Automotive operation. Far from hurting my reputation, it seemed to have enhanced it considerably. Honest mechanics, it turned out, really didn't like being associated with criminals who made the entire profession look bad. I accepted a position with Rodriguez Brothers Automotive, a family-owned shop with a reputation for integrity and quality work. They offered me a senior mechanic position with a salary that was 20% higher than what I'd been making at Chen's. But the real satisfaction came a month later when I received another call from Agent Mitchell. She told me that Marcus had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was providing information about the broader network of auto theft and parts laundering operations that he'd been involved with, leading to additional arrests and investigations across multiple states. Tony, meanwhile, was looking at substantial prison time on multiple felony charges. His gambling debts had made him desperate enough to participate in serious crimes, but not smart enough to negotiate a better deal when everything collapsed. The professional thieves who'd been arrested during the Saturday night bust had also agreed to cooperate, providing information about other criminal operations they'd worked with over the years. Agent Mitchell estimated that the investigation I'd initiated would ultimately result in dozens of arrests and the dismantling of several major criminal enterprises involved in auto theft, insurance fraud, and parts laundering. All because I'd refused to accept being fired quietly. 6 months after my termination from Chen's Automotive, I was settled into my new position at Rodriguez Brothers and building relationships with a new customer base. I'd received a settlement from Marcus's insurance company for my wrongful termination, though the amount was modest compared to the satisfaction I'd gotten from watching his entire criminal operation collapse. I'd also been contacted by a true crime podcast that wanted to interview me about my role in exposing the auto theft ring. I politely declined. The story was satisfying enough without turning it into entertainment. One afternoon, I was working on a particularly complex transmission repair when Carlos Rodriguez, the shop's owner, approached me with a newspaper clipping. It was a brief item from the court reporter section. Marcus Chen had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. Tony Ramirez had received 6 years on similar charges. The article mentioned that both men had agreed to pay substantial restitution to victims of their crimes, though it was unclear whether they would have the financial resources to actually do so. Carlos asked if I wanted to talk about it. I told him there wasn't much to say. Sometimes people make bad choices, and sometimes those choices catch up with them. What I didn't tell Carlos was how I'd felt reading that article. It wasn't triumph exactly, or even satisfaction. It was something quieter and more complex. A sense that justice had been served, that the universe had corrected an imbalance, that actions had finally met appropriate consequences. Marcus and Tony had stolen more than just car parts. They'd stolen trust, reputation, and security from people who'd never done anything to deserve it. They'd corrupted a legitimate business and damaged the reputation of an entire profession. They'd also tried to destroy my career to cover their own crimes. Now they were paying the price for all of it. I finished the transmission repair that afternoon and moved on to the next job. A routine brake service on a Honda Civic, not much different from my own. Simple, honest work, the kind I'd been doing for most of my adult life. As I worked, I thought about the path that had led me from that humiliating afternoon when Marcus had fired me to this moment, when I was rebuilding my career at a shop that valued integrity and quality workmanship. It had been a long journey, but I'd learned something important along the way. Revenge, when it's justified and executed properly, doesn't just punish the guilty, it restores balance. It reminds everyone involved that actions have consequences, that truth eventually surfaces, that justice may be delayed but rarely denied. Marcus and Tony had thought they were smart enough to get away with their crimes. They'd thought they could use me as a scapegoat and move on with their lives, leaving me to deal with the consequences of their actions. They'd been wrong about that, but more than anything else, they'd underestimated what an honest mechanic was capable of when he decided to stop being quiet and start fighting back. That was their biggest mistake of all.